13,004 Australians were sent into the jungle to build a railway for Japan. 2,802 of them died doing it. Not in battle. Building a railway. By hand, with picks and hammers and bamboo, in 16 months, through 415 kilometers of jungle and mountain that Japanese engineers had said would take 5 years. The men who survived came home at 45 kilograms, and the country they came back to didn't ask what had happened to them. I spent months going through Australian war memorial records, Death Railway war crimes tribunal transcripts, and survivor testimonies to bring you this documentary. What's at stake here isn't just one construction project in one forgotten corner of the Pacific War. It's the question of why 2,802 Australians died building a railway for the country that had imprisoned them, and why the war crimes trials that followed produced convictions that were overturned within years while the survivors came home to silence. Everyone knows The Bridge on the River Kwai. The film, the story, the drama of Allied prisoners building a Japanese railway in the jungle. But here's what that version leaves out. The Bridge on the River Kwai is a fiction. The Death Railway was real. And the real story, the one that happened to 13,000 Australians in the jungles of Thailand and Burma, is nothing like what Hollywood put on screen. This is that story. And it starts here. On the 15th of February, 15,000 Australians became prisoners of war in Singapore. They were marched to Changi, a sprawling prison complex on the eastern tip of the island, and they waited. For weeks, they didn't know what came next. What came next was the railway. Japan needed a land route connecting its conquests across Southeast Asia. A railway linking Burma to Thailand, 415 kilometers of track through some of the most impenetrable jungle on Earth. Japanese engineers had estimated the construction would take 5 to 6 years. Japan gave its commanders 16 months. To build it, they needed labor, and they had 60,000 Allied prisoners sitting in camps across Singapore and the Dutch East Indies. Approximately 13,000 of them were Australian. The journey to the railway started in June 1942. The Australians were loaded onto ships, not transport vessels with adequate facilities. Hell ships, 30 to 40 men per sealed hold. No ventilation, minimal water, minimal food. Dysentery spreading through the holds within days. Men dying before the ships reached their destination, and above them, Allied submarines patrolling the same water submarines that had no way of knowing that the unmarked Japanese vessels they were targeting had Allied prisoners locked in their holds. Some ships were sunk. Some prisoners drowned in the holds they couldn't escape. Others reached Thailand. From the Thai port of Ban Pong, the next stage was the train, 30 to 40 men per goods wagon. 5 days. Suffocating heat. Minimal stops for food or water or basic human needs. Men buying food at exorbitant prices from local vendors during the rare stops because the rations provided weren't enough to sustain them. Then, the march. From the railheads into the jungle. Hundreds of kilometers on foot through terrain that had no roads, no infrastructure, and no preparation for the arrival of thousands of sick and malnourished men. When they arrived at the construction camps, the reality of what they had been brought there to do became clear. They had been told they were going to do honorable military work, that the conditions would be reasonable, that they would be back in Singapore within months. None of that was true. What was waiting for them in the jungle camps was not honorable military work. It was slavery. And 2,800 Australians would die before the railway was finished. The Burma-Thailand Railway was 415 kilometers of track, through dense jungle, through mountain ranges, through rivers that flooded without warning and terrain that had defeated every previous attempt to build anything through it. Japanese engineers knew it was nearly impossible. They built it anyway, in 16 months, using prisoners of war as the labor force. The work started in October 1942, 12 to 18 hours a day. Picks, hammers, dynamite when they had it, bare hands when they didn't, cutting rock, felling jungle, laying sleepers in track across ground that fought back at every meter. The daily ration was approximately 500 to 600 calories of rotting rice. Not enough to sustain a man resting. Far less than enough to sustain a man doing 16 hours of heavy labor in tropical heat. Water came from contaminated sources. Medicine was almost non-existent. And the guards, Japanese and Korean soldiers in Japanese service, enforced the work quotas with bamboo rods, wooden clubs, and iron bars. Then came the speedo. In April 1943, the Japanese command accelerated the construction timeline. The railway had to be finished faster, which meant the men had to work faster. Shifts extended to 15 and 18 hours. Work continued through the night by the light of oil lamps and bamboo fires. The daily rock-cutting quota, normally 1 meter per team, was pushed to 2 and 3 meters through solid granite by men who were already dying. Hellfire Pass. The Konyu cutting in the Tenasserim Hills of Thailand. 150 meters of solid rock that had to be cut by hand. The Australians of F-Force worked this section in the worst months of the speedo. At night, the fires and lamps used to extend the working hours gave the cutting a hellish glow visible from kilometers away. The men working in it called it Hellfire Pass. Between April and June 1943, approximately 700 Australians died at and around Hellfire Pass. 69 of them were beaten to death by guards. Not worked to death. Beaten. For being too slow. For collapsing. For being too sick to swing a pick at the required pace. Malaria swept through the camps. Then cholera. Then dysentery and beriberi simultaneously. Men who had marched into the jungle camps in October 1942, weighing 70 or 80 kilograms, were down to 40 by mid-1943. Walking skeletons swinging picks at granite in the dark. The Japanese guards had nicknames among the prisoners. Not affectionate ones. Names based on the particular form of brutality each guard preferred. The guard the prisoners called Speedo, named for his habit of screaming the word at men who were physically incapable of working faster, became one of the most feared figures on the entire railway. On the 17th of October, 1943, the last section of track was laid. The Burma-Thailand Railway was complete. 415 kilometres. Built in 16 months. By 60,000 Allied prisoners and approximately 200,000 Asian laborers conscripted under conditions even worse than those experienced by the POWs. The cost in Australian lives was 2,800 dead. Dead from disease, from starvation, from beatings, from being worked to death on a railway that Japan needed and treated human beings as the fuel to build it. 13,004 Australian prisoners were sent to the death railway. 2,802 of them died. 1 in 5 dead from starvation, from disease, from beatings administered by guards who were later tried as war criminals and in most cases released within years of conviction. The railway was completed in October 1943. The men who had survived it didn't come home until the war ended August 1945. Nearly 2 more years in Japanese captivity after the railway was finished. 2 more years of camps, of disease, of the slow accumulation of damage that doesn't stop just because the construction work does. When the survivors finally boarded ships back to Australia in late 1945, the average weight of a returning prisoner was 45 kilograms. Men who had left Australia at 70 or 80 kilograms. Returning at 45, covered in tropical ulcers, carrying malaria that would recur for years, carrying something else that had no name yet in 1945, but would eventually be called post-traumatic stress disorder. The reception that waited for them was not a parade. It was not a ceremony. It was not a country that had prepared itself to hear what they had been through. It was a society that had spent 4 years trying to keep itself functioning under the pressure of a war that threatened its existence. A society that was exhausted. A society that looked at the men coming off those ships, skeletal, damaged, carrying things behind their eyes that didn't translate into conversation and didn't quite know what to do with them. So it did what societies often do with things they don't know how to process. It moved on. The men who came back from the Death Railway largely didn't talk about it. Not immediately, not for years, many not for the rest of their lives. The military had orders about what could and couldn't be disclosed. But beyond the official restrictions, there was something else. A social pressure. The sense that what they had experienced was so far outside the frame of normal human experience that describing it to someone who hadn't been there was almost impossible. That talking about it made you seem weak. That the culture of mateship and stoicism that had helped them survive the railway was now working against them because that same culture said, you got on with it. You didn't dwell. You didn't show the cost. Milton Fairclough, one of the survivors who documented his experience, described coming home and finding that the people around him simply didn't have a framework for what he was trying to say. Not because they didn't care, because what happened on the Death Railway was genuinely outside anything they had a reference point for. So the silence settled in, and for many families, it lasted decades. The war crimes trials began in 1945 and continued until 1951. Hundreds of Japanese and Korean guards were prosecuted for their conduct on the railway. 23 were executed in Singapore. Yi Hak-nae, one of the Korean guards, was sentenced to death. His sentence was commuted to 20 years. He was released early. The pattern that had appeared at Ambon and Sandakan repeated itself at the Death Railway trials. Convictions, sentence, and then the Cold War, and then amnesty, and then the men who had beaten Australian prisoners to death at Hellfire Pass were free, while the survivors were still waking up at night. The recognition came slowly. It always does for these stories. In the 1980s and 1990s, Australian veterans of the Death Railway began to speak more openly. The Australian War Memorial began preserving their testimonies. In 19985, 5 years after Hellfire Pass, the Hellfire Pass Memorial was opened in Thailand, funded by the Australian government. A walking path through the cutting where 700 Australians died in 2 months. Where 69 men were beaten to death for working too slowly, where the fires burned through the night and the men called it hell because they couldn't think of another word that fit. In 2023, the 80th anniversary of the railway's completion was marked with ceremonies in Australia and Thailand. 2,802 Australians, 1 in 5 of everyone who went. And for decades after they came home, almost no one asked them what it had been like. Because the asking was uncomfortable. Because the answers were harder to hear than most people were prepared for. Because it was easier to move forward than to turn around and look at what had actually happened. The men who built the Death Railway deserved better than that. They deserved better from their government, better from their country, and better from the history books that filed them under a footnote while the bridge over the River Kwai became a movie and the real story stayed silent. There is one story that connects directly to everything you've just watched. The men who built the Death Railway didn't start there. They started at Singapore, and the story of how 15,000 Australians ended up as prisoners in Singapore, the decisions that were made, the promises that were broken, the blame that was placed on the wrong people, is the story this channel hasn't told yet. It's the story of a betrayal that started in London. And it's the next video. If you want to see it, it's right up here.